Melachim Bet, chapter 8, perek Chet. Well, remember in perek Dalet the famous story of Elisha and the Isha Shunamit, the woman who he promised she'll have a baby. She had a baby, the child grew up, died, and then Elisha brought him back to life. Well, we hear back from her again. Elisha tells her in perek Chet, he says, listen, there's about to be a famine in the land of Israel. Go for 7 years, go leave the land, go somewhere else so that you don't starve to death. And indeed, she goes to the land of Pelishtim, the Philistines, for 7 years. She comes back, surprise, surprise. Her home and her fields have been taken over. Someone squatted and went into them and took her land. And she comes to the king and she's screaming. She says, King, my lands have been taken. As she's coming in, Gehazi, remember the rebellious, somewhat wicked assistant of Elisha, is sitting with the king, and the king is asking Gehazi to tell him stories about the miracles of Elisha. As Gehazi is telling King Yehoshaphat the miracles of Elisha, who's unfortunately apparently no longer with us, the woman walks in and Gehazi says, here she is, this is it, this is the woman who I've been telling you, Elisha promised she'll have a child, the child then was brought back to life by Elisha, and this is her. And she comes and says, my dear king, all of my land has been stolen. So the king says, listen, go back and with my order, with my people, go back to your field. Not only does the squatter need to give you back your field and your house, but he also has to pay you for all of the produce that he produced in 7 years. So basically, he has to pay back everything he used for the past 7 years. That is the first story in this chapter. The next story has to do with our enemy, frenemy. I'm not even sure how to call them. Aram. They're the neighbors. They're where Syria is now. And Elisha goes to Damascus, and he hears that the king of Aram, Ben-Hadad, is sick. And so the king tells his assistant named Chazael, he tells him, go speak to the man of God and ask him, am I going to live from this sickness? So Chazael approaches Elisha in Damascus, and he says, on behalf of my master, King Ben-Hadad, will the king Ben-Hadad, who is now sick, come back to life from this sickness? Is he going to survive this sickness? Remember, in those days, someone could die from fever. So he says, will he survive this sickness? And so Elisha tells him, I want to tell you two things. And he says, I'm crying. And he says, I'm crying. Why am I crying? He tells Chazael, I'm crying because I know what you're going to do to the people of Israel. Chazael is a servant. He came to ask Elisha if his master, Ben-Hadad, the king of Aram, is going to live. And Elisha cries and says, I know what you, Chazael, are going to do to the people of Israel. And he says to him, yes. Why? Because you are going to be the king of Aram instead of your master who will die from this sickness. Not only that, you'll then go to Israel, you'll conquer it, and you'll do the most nasty things in the world to the people of Israel. You'll butcher and massacre them when you go into your barbaric war with them. But I ask you for one thing. When you go back to your master, don't tell him he's about to die. And indeed, Chazael goes back to Ben-Hadad and he says, sir, the prophet said you're going to live. And then there's actually a very sinister verse. It says that Chazael takes a cloth soaked with water to cool off the king Ben-Hadad from his fever, and he puts it on his face, and the king dies. It's not clear if the king dies naturally, because that was the time to die, or if perhaps Chazael, the wicked guy, sped up his death by choking him. Anyhow, either way, Chazael becomes the next king. And now you have a change of the guards in the kingdoms of Judea and Israel. Remember, these are two separate kingdoms, so you have to track. Sometimes it's the most confusing part of Melachim, is to track the kings in the two different kingdoms. And so, in the year 5 of Yoram, the son of Achav, and Yehoshaphat, the king of Yehuda, Yehoshaphat, the king of Yehuda, dies, and his son Yoram becomes the king of Yehuda. So now you have both Yehuda and Israel ruled by kings named Yoram. If it wasn't confusing enough with the names, now you have both Israel and Yehuda ruled by Yoram. For Yisrael, it's Yoram son of Achav, and for Yehuda, it's Yoram son of Yehoshaphat. Anyhow, the Yoram, the king of Yehuda, unfortunately, you can tell by his name, he took on a name from the kingdom of Israel. He married the daughter of Achav, and you can expect bad things to happen. The influence of the house of Achav and Izebel comes on him, and really, he becomes an idol worshiper, and he's the king of Yehuda. Remember, the kingdom of Yehuda is supposed to be the more righteous kingdom, and unfortunately, he doesn't do that. Now, God, in the case of the kingdom of Israel, decided to completely expel them and decimate the kingdom of Israel. But in the case of Yehuda, it says a very moving verse, V'lo ava Hashem la'ashchit et Yehuda leman David avdo. God decided not to destroy the kingdom of Yehuda because he remained faithful of the vow to his servant David. Kasher amar latet lo nir ulevanav kol yamim. He said he's going to let him and his sons become the king. Unfortunately, something bad happened, and Edom decided to provoke Yehuda, who used to dominate them, and stop paying their taxes. Yoram decides to go and fight with Edom, and he gets killed in the battle with Edom, just to be succeeded with his son Achaziah. Then, 12 years after Yoram's kingdom, Achaziah, son of Yehoram, the king of Yehuda, becomes the king. Achaziah is 22 when he becomes a king, and unfortunately, he remains a king only for 1 year. That's it. That's a pretty short term. And the name of his mother is a name that actually is a term in English. Her name is Ataliyahu, which became, I don't know if it's because of Christian sources or they got it from here, but Athaliah became like the epitome of a wicked queen. And so the mother of Achaziah is Ataliyahu, the daughter of Omri. And he too, Achaziah, follows in the path of Achav. He's the descendant of the house of Achav. And so Yoram, the son of Achav, goes to fight with Hazael, the king of Aram. And Yoram goes to decide to heal himself. Yoram, the king of Israel, that is to say. We're now switching to Yoram, the king of Israel. And he goes to heal himself from the injury that he got in combat, and he goes to heal himself in the valley of Israel. So that is chapter 8, but it's important to note two things. First of all, that you have two things here. You have Yoram from the kingdom of Yehuda, who gets killed in combat with Edom, and you also have, afterwards, Yoram the son of Achav, and he also gets into a war with Hazael, the king of Aram, and it takes place in Ramot Gilad. By the way, cross-reference, that's where the king of all of us, Shaul, got killed. And then Yoram goes to heal himself from the injuries that he got from the Aramim. And Achaziah, the king of Yehuda, comes to visit him in the valley of Yisrael. There is a crazy scene about to take place in the next chapter, but that is already perek tet. Stay tuned. Thank you for listening.